Royal Lodge does not shout for attention the way some royal estates do. It does not stand on a hilltop with shining spires or glitter across the horizon like a palace carved out of a fairy tale. Instead, it hides, quietly, deliberately, behind ancient oaks and rolling lawns inside Windsor Great Park. From the very first glance, that secrecy feels intentional, as if the house is both inviting and warning at the same time. Visitors who manage to see it from a distance describe a mansion that looks peaceful and timeless, its pale walls reflecting soft English light, its long driveway curving gently toward a facade that seems to whisper rather than declare. But the closer one gets, the more the illusion shifts. Something about this place suggests that beauty is only the first layer, and that the real story lies deeper, behind the trimmed hedges and guarded gates. For decades, Royal Lodge has been one of Britain's least understood royal residences, a property that appears on maps yet rarely in public conversations, a house associated with privilege but surrounded by questions that never seem to fade. Even those who live within Windsor's orbit speak about it with a strange mixture of respect and curiosity, as if the estate itself possesses a presence larger than its size. People wonder why it remains so inaccessible, what secrets its rooms hold, and how a home that once symbolized quiet comfort turned into a stage for some of the most puzzling events in recent royal history. It is not merely the architecture or the grandeur of the lawns that draw attention. It is the contradictions, the polished exterior hiding decades of erosion, the peaceful setting masking intense internal conflict, the calm facade covering a storm of financial and personal pressures. From afar, the mansion looks unquestionably noble. Its cream-colored walls stand firm against a backdrop of tall trees that sway in the wind, creating a feeling of harmony between nature and history. The rooflines, symmetrical and deliberate, speak to centuries of architectural intention. And yet, beneath this elegance, rumors have long circulated about what is happening inside. Whispered conversations in cafes near Windsor mention rooms that have lost their shine, corridors where the air feels heavier than it should, and areas of the house that show their age in ways no royal residence should. These stories persist not because they are dramatic, but because Royal Lodge has become a house where the line between myth and reality is unusually thin. Its location only adds to the mystery. Nestled just 3 miles from Windsor Castle, the beating heart of monarchy for centuries, Royal Lodge sits close enough to feel the pulse of royal life, yet distant enough to function as an escape from it. It is neither fully public nor entirely private, a place meant for retreat but constantly tugged back into the spotlight. The contrast fuels endless fascination. How can a house so deeply tied to the royal world remain so hidden, yet so endlessly discussed? How did a residence filled with childhood memories, celebration, and tradition become one of the most debated and scrutinized addresses in the country? Part of the intrigue comes from the fact that Royal Lodge seems to live 2 lives at once. In photographs, it appears serene, almost idyllic, a country home with manicured lawns and soft sunlight slipping across its veranda. In news reports, however, it transforms into something far more complex, a structure struggling under the weight of age, a property demanding enormous resources to survive, and a backdrop to conflicts that reach far beyond its walls. Every detail of its exterior invites admiration, yet every story that emerges raises more questions than answers. The result is a sense of tension that can be felt even from outside the gates, as if the house itself is holding its breath. Those who know Windsor Great Park describe the approach to Royal Lodge as strangely cinematic. The long paths through the forest create a rhythm, tree, shadow, clearing, light, until the mansion finally appears in a soft, muted glow. It looks like a place designed for peace, not conflict, but the air around it carries a quiet intensity, a sense that something is unfolding behind closed doors, something that has turned this secluded estate into one of the most talked about properties in modern Britain. More than once, visitors have said that standing by the gates feels like looking at a painting with hidden brushstrokes, beautiful from afar, but full of details that shift the longer you study them. Perhaps that is what makes Royal Lodge so compelling. It is not simply a home, it is a paradox, a residence born in simplicity yet wrapped in centuries of privilege. A place of joy now overshadowed by uncertainty, A house admired for its grace, but whispered about for its secrets. And as its story unfolds, it becomes clear that this mansion, tucked away behind towering trees, is not hiding by accident. It is hiding because the truth inside it has become too heavy, too tangled, and too mesmerizing to ignore. From a distance, Royal Lodge still maintains the quiet dignity expected of a royal residence. The pale exterior catches the light in a way that softens its age, and the sweeping lawns create an impression of calm order, as if the property has existed in a permanent state of harmony. Visitors who glimpse it from the edge of Windsor Great Park often describe the same first reaction: a sense of tranquility, the kind that comes only from a house built to withstand centuries. Yet, the moment one steps closer, that impression begins to shift, slowly at first, then abruptly, revealing details that challenge everything the elegant facade tries to hide. The windows, framed by perfectly balanced Georgian lines, seem pristine until you notice small distortions in the glass, a subtle hint of long-ignored repairs. The paint across the exterior walls retains its classical cream tone, but upon close inspection, it is clear that layers beneath are beginning to buckle. Tiny cracks appear like delicate veins, easy to overlook individually, but impossible to ignore once they form a network stretching across the surface. What should feel like the firmness of history instead feels fragile, almost strained, as if time itself has begun to pry at the structure. And the moment you step through the doors, the contrast sharpens. Inside, the grand hallway no longer carries the soft echo of footsteps across immaculate floors. Instead, there is a faint, persistent mustiness that settles in the air, signaling moisture where it doesn't belong. In some corners, the wallpaper curls away from the plaster. In others, the plaster itself reveals thin fractures running in uneven lines across ceilings once admired for their symmetry. Rooms that must have once glowed with warmth and royal charm now seem dimmer, their elegance muted by the slow, steady encroachment of neglect. The deeper one moves through the residence, the more evident the problems become. Narrow corridors feel cooler than they should, not because of deliberate temperature control, but because drafts slip through window frames that have lost their seal. A once celebrated drawing room reveals patches of discoloration beneath its crown molding. A guest bedroom shows faint markings in the corners, darkening spots that experts later identified as early signs of mold. These are not dramatic disasters, but quiet warnings. Each one is small enough to fix alone, yet together they form a mosaic of decline that is far more alarming than any single flaw could be. It doesn't take long to realize that Royal Lodge is a house in conflict with itself. On one hand, it still tries to project the grandeur that defined it for centuries. On the other, the structure seems to whisper its exhaustion. Engineers who examined the property spoke of foundational concerns that require not just cosmetic work, but serious reconstruction. They described wooden beams weakened by moisture, roofing materials reaching the end of their lifespan, and sections of the estate where restoration would cost more than rebuilding entirely. Their findings painted a picture not of gentle aging, but of a building fighting to hold itself together against the weight of history. Even the gardens, once carefully shaped into seasonal displays of color, reveal signs of strain. The sweeping lawns remain striking from afar, but patches lose their richness where underground irrigation has faltered. Shrubs once sculpted into perfect symmetry now grow unevenly, and statues placed by the Queen Mother stand surrounded by overgrowth that creeps higher each year. The grounds still offer beauty, but it is the kind that depends on distance. Up close, nature begins reclaiming the land in slow, silent steps. This dual identity creates a tension impossible to ignore. The house still knows how to perform, how to present itself as a symbol of stability and tradition. But beneath that performance lies a battle. Cracks widening behind freshly repainted surfaces, moisture gathering behind decorative panels, memories preserved in rooms no longer able to support their own weight. And the more one looks, the harder it becomes to shake the question that emerges naturally from every fading detail. How could a residence of this caliber, positioned at the heart of royal history, fall into such a state? That question lingers in every corridor and every shadowed corner. It follows anyone who walks through the estate, and it hangs over the lawns like a quiet uncertainty. The answer is not found in the peeling paint or the fractured beams, but in the decades of decisions, inheritances, conflicts, and expectations that shaped Royal Lodge. To understand how such a grand home reached the edge of collapse, one must move backward, far earlier than the current generation, into the origins of this land, before royal titles and ceremonial gardens, when Royal Lodge was not yet a lodge at all. Long before its lawns were patrolled by guards, long before royal carriages rolled up its drive, the land that would become Royal Lodge existed in a very different rhythm. There were no geometric gardens, no sweeping verandas, no ornate facades meant to impress visiting dignitaries. Instead, there were open pastures stretching toward the horizon, surrounded by clusters of old trees whose branches moved lazily with the wind. The landscape felt untouched, shaped more by seasons than by human intention. At its center stood a modest farmhouse known as Watkins House, a small, practical dwelling built for work rather than elegance. Its walls carried the scent of hay and soil, and its windows looked out over herds of cattle grazing across fields lined with hedges and wildflowers. This was a world of simplicity, where life followed the cycles of sunrise, harvest, and winter frost. The early owners of this land lived quietly, far from courtly intrigue or ceremonial duties. They tended livestock, repaired fences, and managed the slow but steady business of farming. Horses trotted across dirt paths, worn smooth from years of use. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney during cold mornings, drifting upward until the wind carried it across the meadows. In the evenings, the only sounds were the distant calls of birds settling into their branches, and the soft clatter of tools being put away for the night. It was a peaceful, unremarkable life, the kind that rarely finds its way into official histories, yet forms the earliest layer of a place's identity. By the mid-1600s, Watkins House had become a familiar landmark in the area, a humble but reliable structure surrounded by patches of cultivated land. The farm changed hands occasionally, as properties often did in those days, but nothing about it suggested that it would one day become a site of royal significance. Even so, there was something about the land itself that encouraged a sense of quiet admiration. The natural elevation offered sweeping views of Windsor Park's rolling terrain. The forest edge provided shade in the summer and shelter during harsher months, and the gentle slope of the meadows created an almost painterly landscape long before a painter ever set foot there. By 1750, the farm found itself in the hands of Thomas Sandby, a man whose presence would mark the first real shift in the land's destiny. Sandby was not a nobleman, but an artist, architect, and mapmaker whose talent placed him among respected creative minds of his time. Unlike previous occupants, he did not view Watkins House merely as a place for livestock and crops. His artistic eye saw potential where others saw routine. He noticed the soft contours of the hills, the natural light that washed across the fields, and the way the trees framed the sky like the edges of a grand landscape painting. His influence did not transform the farmhouse into a palace, but he brought a quiet refinement to the property, a touch of grace that hinted at what the land could one day become. Sandby's years there blended the practical and the picturesque. He improved the farmhouse without stripping it of its simplicity, adding small touches that reflected his aesthetic sensibilities. Pathways became slightly more deliberate, windows positioned to capture more sunlight. Visitors spoke of the property as charming rather than merely functional, an unusual compliment for what was still, at its core, a working farm. It was as if the estate had taken its first step toward a new identity, moving gently away from its purely agricultural past. What made this evolution remarkable was how subtle it remained. Nothing about the farm screamed ambition. It did not strive for grandeur, yet its newfound elegance seemed to invite something greater. The land held a quiet magnetism, a rare harmony between nature and human touch that made it stand out from the many other farms scattered across the region. It was precisely this understated beauty that would catch the attention of higher circles, an allure strong enough to draw the notice of royalty in the years to come. As the 18th century slowly unfolded, the farm's simplicity became the very quality that distinguished it. Its meadows, once meant only for grazing, now appeared as potential garden grounds. Its secluded location, once appreciated for peace and practicality, now offered privacy for those who might crave an escape from the rigid structure of royal life. Without realizing it, the land was preparing itself for a transformation that would alter its destiny forever. The quiet farmhouse, standing against the soft English landscape, was no longer just a farm. It was the seed of something larger, waiting for the moment when its unassuming charm would cross paths with royal need. And that moment would arrive sooner than anyone living there could have imagined, carrying with it a future king, an ambitious architect, and the first steps toward turning this peaceful patch of countryside into a royal retreat. By the early 1800s, the quiet charm of the old farm had begun to draw attention far beyond Windsor's rustic outskirts. What had once been a peaceful agricultural corner, shaped by the steady rhythm of farming life, now seemed unusually appealing to those seeking refuge from the formalities of court. Windsor Great Park was already a cherished landscape for the royal family, vast, wooded, and close enough to London to remain connected, yet distant enough to feel like a true escape. And it was within this environment that the unassuming farmhouse caught the eye of someone whose presence would alter its fate entirely. George, Prince of Wales, the future king. George IV was a man of taste, extravagance, and an unending desire for comfort wrapped in beauty. He had an instinct for places that could become something grander than they were, and in Watkins House he saw potential that others had overlooked. At the time, the nearby Cumberland Lodge was undergoing significant reconstruction, leaving the prince in need of a temporary residence that offered privacy without sacrificing proximity to the heart of Windsor. The modest farmhouse might not have seemed an obvious choice, but its seclusion and natural charm made it an ideal retreat for a royal accustomed to both luxury and scrutiny. When the prince moved in around 1812, everything changed. His arrival marked a turning point, the moment when the land stopped being merely a farm and began its transformation into a royal sanctuary. The farmhouse, which had never been intended for noble living, suddenly found itself filled with attendants, advisors, and the bustle that accompanies a member of the royal family. Its simple rooms were no match for the prince's expectations, and it quickly became clear that something more refined was needed. The structure had personality, yes, but not the kind of elegance that matched the lifestyle of a future monarch. To bring the property closer to what he envisioned, George turned to one of the greatest architects of his era, John Nash. Nash was already a celebrated figure, known for his ability to blend fantasy with function, crafting buildings that felt both whimsical and royal. He understood the prince's desire for a retreat that offered comfort without excessive grandeur, a place where elegance could be softened by nature rather than drowned in ceremonial formality. The partnership between the artistic architect and the imaginative prince would become the spark that ignited the birth of Royal Lodge. Nash saw in the farmhouse what the land itself had been suggesting for decades. He imagined a residence that felt almost like a storybook cottage, but one built with the subtle luxury suited to royalty. Instead of imposing towers or rigid symmetry, he envisioned gentle slopes, thatched roofs, and verandas that wrapped the home in a sense of calm. He leaned into the idyllic landscape, allowing the house to appear as if it had grown organically from the soil rather than being constructed upon it. His plans were neither showy nor ostentatious. They were intimate, carefully tailored to complement the natural beauty already present. Under Nash's direction, the transformation began. Walls were expanded, windows enlarged to let in more light, and new spaces shaped to blend comfort with artistic flair. The farmhouse ceased to exist as it once had. In its place rose a romantic retreat designed for quiet evenings, private gatherings, and strolls through the surrounding meadows. The prince no longer lived in temporary accommodation. He lived in a place reshaped by vision and craftsmanship, a sanctuary that matched his tastes while remaining unpretentious enough to feel separate from the ceremonial burden of royal life. Visitors who came during this period spoke of a house that felt alive with charm. It had the warmth of a countryside home, but the refinement of a royal residence. Light filtered through windows overlooking gardens that were beginning to take shape, and verandas offered shaded spots where the prince could read, dine, or simply enjoy the calm of Windsor away from the demands of London. The estate became a retreat not just for George himself, but for those in his circle who craved a place where they could escape the pressures of public life. What none of them could have predicted was how deeply this change would shape the future of the property. Nash's redesign was more than a renovation. It was the moment Watkins House officially stepped into its new identity as a royal home. The land had been preparing for this shift for decades, its quiet beauty quietly inviting something greater. Under the direction of a visionary architect and a prince with a taste for elegance, the transformation was complete. A simple farm had become a royal refuge, the earliest spark of what would eventually grow into the estate known today as Royal Lodge. And as the 19th century unfolded, the house's journey was far from over. Forces beyond its walls, royal preferences, political changes, and shifting visions of grandeur would soon push its evolution even further, reshaping its identity again in ways that no one living there during those early years could have imagined. When John Nash first stepped onto the grounds of the old farmhouse, he was not simply looking at a building in need of refinement. He was studying a blank canvas, one shaped by pastures, rolling hills, and soft English light. His task was not to erect a palace, but to transform a humble dwelling into a retreat that felt enchanted, intimate, and effortlessly regal. Nash had already built his reputation as an architect who could merge fantasy with structure, someone capable of creating spaces that felt like they belonged equally to dreams and to the real world. And the moment he examined the property, he saw the beginning of something unlike any other residence in the royal orbit. His vision did not depend on grandeur or monumental scale. Instead, he leaned into the quiet beauty of the landscape and imagined a place where royalty could escape the formalities of court. He wanted the estate to look as though it had grown from the earth itself, shaped subtly by human hands but still loyal to the countryside that surrounded it. In Nash's mind, the future Royal Lodge would not be a grand palace. It would be a romantic escape, a rural hideaway softened by natural textures, gentle lines, and hints of theatrical charm. At the center of his design was an idea that seemed almost revolutionary for its time. Luxury does not always need to shout. It can whisper. It can conceal itself behind thatched roofs, curved verandas, and walls painted in muted tones that blend seamlessly into the greens and golds of Windsor Great Park. Nash embraced this philosophy wholeheartedly. He envisioned thatched roofing not as a rustic necessity, but as a deliberate aesthetic choice, an invitation to approach the home with a sense of wonder. He softened the edges of the structure with sweeping hillside curves and introduced verandas that wrapped the house like open arms, offering shade and serenity in equal measure. His redesign encouraged movement, not just through the rooms, but around the entire property. Nash believed a home should invite exploration. He created pathways that drifted through small clearings, windows positioned to frame the most picturesque parts of the meadows, and entrances placed not for practicality alone, but for the feeling they inspired when approached. Walking up to the house under his design felt like stepping into a painting, one composed of soft textures, warm wood, and carefully balanced symmetry that never felt rigid. Inside, he emphasized intimacy. Rather than constructing imposing halls, he leaned into the idea of quiet luxury. Rooms were shaped to feel comforting, rather than ceremonial, with gentle curves, chimneys positioned for cozy evenings, and spaces designed to reflect natural light through soft wooden accents. The effect was immediate. While still unmistakably royal, the atmosphere felt more like a countryside sanctuary than a formal residence. It was a place where the Prince of Wales could entertain close friends without the weight of ceremony, or escape into private reflection without feeling encased in marble and gold. This transformation marked the birth of the estate's first true identity. Before Nash, the land had personality, but no purpose beyond practicality. Under Nash, it gained character, a playful yet elegant spirit that blended the romance of rural living with the refinement of aristocratic taste. His style became a legend not because it was flamboyant, but because it was sincere. He did not try to overpower the landscape. He worked with it, allowing the home to feel like part of the scenery rather than an interruption. As the residence evolved under his guidance, visitors spoke of its charm as though it had always been there. The romantic style, softened by natural materials and designed to feel timeless, left an impression so strong that even later transformations could not erase it. Nash's Royal Lodge was not just a renovation. It was the foundation of the estate's enduring identity. Every future version of the house would echo his choices, whether through the curves of a roofline, the placement of a veranda, or the unspoken promise that this was a place meant for retreat and imagination. And although the house would later shift toward more formal architectural styles, Nash's fairy tale influence never disappeared. It lingered in the way visitors describe the estate, in the stories told about its early days, and in the quiet corners of the grounds that still feel touched by his vision. The romantic rural residence he created marked the moment the property truly became Royal Lodge, a home shaped not only by royalty, but by creativity, emotion, and a belief that even those born into duty deserve a sanctuary carved gently out of nature. Yet the story of Royal Lodge would evolve once more. Nash's dreamlike creation would soon face criticism, reconstruction, and the strong opinions of a king determined to reshape the estate in his own image. The romantic refuge that John Nash crafted might have endured as a timeless idol, if not for the fierce practicality of the monarch who followed. When George IV's brother, William IV, took the throne in 1830, he inherited more than a kingdom. He inherited a long list of frustrations about the lavish spending habits of his predecessor. And among the projects that stirred his irritation, Royal Lodge stood almost at the top. To William, the cozy, whimsical residence that Nash had expanded was not a delightful retreat, but an indulgence, a symbol of excess disguised as rustic charm. Where George saw beauty, William saw unnecessary extravagance. The new king had little patience for ornamental flourishes or sentimental design. He believed that royal homes should convey strength, order, and restraint, not fantasy. Royal Lodge, with its thatched roofs and fairy tale aesthetic, struck him as frivolous and impractical, a distraction from the responsibilities of a modernizing monarchy. The very elements that made the house enchanting to visitors were, in his eyes, signs of inattention to duty. And so, in one of the most dramatic decisions in the estate's history, he ordered much of Nash's creation to be torn down. It was not a gentle renovation. Walls that Nash had carefully shaped were dismantled brick by brick. Roof lines he sculpted to blend with the natural slopes of the land were stripped away. The verandas he imagined as soft transitions between indoors and outdoors were removed in favor of sharper, straighter lines. Only one element survived his purge: the conservatory. William spared it, not out of affection for Nash's work, but because it remained practical enough to justify keeping. The rest, he believed, had to go. In place of the romantic rural retreat, William IV directed the construction of something very different, a structure that mirrored the principles of the Georgian style he favored. Georgian architecture prized symmetry, proportion, and clarity. It avoided unnecessary decoration and focused instead on solid lines and balanced compositions. Under this philosophy, Royal Lodge was reborn. The once playful outlines gave way to a central block flanked by two wings, each carefully aligned to project harmony and stability. The roof was rebuilt in clean slopes. Windows were redesigned into evenly spaced frames that emphasized order over whimsy. Even the placement of the entrance reflected intention. Dignified, direct, and unmistakably formal, the transformation was striking. Where Nash had painted with softness, William commanded with structure. The house that rose from the rubble of the old design no longer blended into the landscape. It stood with purpose, as though declaring that royalty did not need to hide behind picturesque illusions. Visitors arriving after the reconstruction often described the mansion as stately rather than charming, refined rather than romantic. The gardens, too, were reshaped to reflect this new tone. Pathways were straightened, plantings arranged with precision, and open lawns emphasized the geometric clarity of the architecture. Yet, beneath this disciplined exterior, hints of the past lingered, not in the building itself, but in the memory of what had existed. Locals who remembered Nash's whimsical retreat spoke of the transformation with mixed feelings. Some admired the new structure for its strength. Others missed the gentler vision that once sat among the trees. Royal Lodge had not lost its soul entirely, but it had shifted dramatically in character, becoming a residence that answered to the mood of a monarch determined to distance himself from his predecessor's indulgences. Over time, the Georgian structure solidified its presence. It weathered storms, adapted to changing royal occupants, and established itself as the architectural identity that still defines the estate today. The crisp lines and balanced proportions have remained remarkably intact through the centuries that followed, anchoring the house in a design language that speaks of tradition rather than experimentation. This reinvention marked the second great turning point in the estate's life, a reminder that Royal Lodge has always been shaped not only by the land or the architects who touched it, but by the personalities and priorities of the monarchs who claimed it. And as the 19th century moved toward its next chapter, the newly rebuilt residence was about to find a new purpose. No longer simply a royal property, but a family home that would shape the childhood of a future queen. By the early years of the 20th century, Royal Lodge was no longer just an architectural experiment shaped by the preferences of successive monarchs. It was a house waiting for a story that would give it warmth, identity, and a deeper emotional meaning. That moment arrived when King George V decided to gift the estate to his second son, Prince Albert, the Duke of York, and his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. Their arrival marked a shift unlike any the property had experienced before. For the first time, Royal Lodge wasn't being molded to serve a royal image. It was being shaped to serve a family. Prince Albert and Elizabeth were not yet destined for the throne. Their lives were quieter than those of the heirs at the center of public attention, and it was precisely that simplicity that made Royal Lodge the ideal place for them. The house, surrounded by meadows and forest, offered the rare luxury of privacy within a royal world. It provided distance from the strict protocols of London and the endless scrutiny of the court. Here, they could build a home without the pressure of ceremony, a home where the atmosphere was softer, the pace slower, and the rooms filled with the sounds of ordinary life rather than constant official demands. Almost immediately, the Duke and Duchess began shaping the estate to reflect their shared love of comfort and nature. Working with architect Sir Eric Saville, they renovated the mansion not to heighten its grandeur, but to make it warmer, more livable. Saville understood their vision. A residence elegant enough for royal guests, yet intimate enough that a child could run down its halls without feeling out of place. Rooms were brightened and expanded to accommodate a growing family. Fireplaces were restored to bring a sense of coziness to winter evenings. Windows were positioned to frame the soft greens and golds of the Windsor landscape. Outside, the gardens became Elizabeth's personal canvas. She poured her affection into them, planting flowers that bloomed in every season, and designing pathways that wound gently between trees and open lawns. Gardeners often recalled seeing her stroll among the rose beds in the early morning light, gently touching petals and assessing which plantings needed more care. Under her guidance, the grounds of Royal Lodge came alive with color and fragrance, transforming into a sanctuary that seemed to reflect her own gentle energy. It was into this peaceful environment that two young princesses would grow, Elizabeth and her younger sister, Margaret. Royal Lodge became the place where their earliest memories formed, not through formal lessons or ceremonial events, but through the simple joys of childhood. They played hide and seek among the trees of Windsor Great Park, chased their dogs across the lawns, and rode ponies along winding forest trails. The house echoed with their laughter, their footsteps, and the bright chatter that filled rooms once known for quiet formality. For the young Princess Elizabeth, who would one day carry the immense weight of monarchy, this environment shaped her in ways no palace could. Royal Lodge gave her space to exist, not as a future sovereign, but as a child discovering the world. She helped feed the family's dogs, studied with tutors at a modest wooden desk, and explored the gardens with a curiosity that mirrored her mother's love of nature. Windsor Castle stood nearby as a symbol of duty, but Royal Lodge offered warmth, safety, and the freedom to grow without constant ceremony. Family friends often remarked on the atmosphere of the home. They described it as cheerful, filled with kindness, a place where one could hear a piano being played in the afternoon, or see the Duke reading quietly by the fire after a long walk through the park. There were picnics on the grass, small gatherings with close friends, and evenings when the household came together simply to share stories. These moments were not grand, but they were meaningful. They created a sense of belonging that would stay with the future queen for the rest of her life. Even the walls of Royal Lodge seemed to absorb this change. The house, once shaped by the ambitions of architects and kings, now carried a different energy, a softness that came from being filled with family life. Each room reflected not only design, but emotion. The drawing room felt lived in rather than staged. Bedrooms glowed with warm lamplight. The gardens, always beautiful, now felt alive with the footsteps of two young sisters exploring every corner. As the world outside moved steadily toward tumultuous decades, Royal Lodge stood as a calm harbor, protecting the Duke and Duchess and their daughters from the harsher realities of the time. It was here that Princess Elizabeth developed the steadiness of character that would later define her leadership. And it was here that she discovered the balance between duty and humanity, a balance she would carry into her future role. Royal Lodge, in these years, was more than a residence. It was a childhood cradle, a family sanctuary, and a quiet world where the future queen learned not only the responsibilities she would face, but the values she would embody. The estate was infused with the spirit of love and stability her parents created, leaving a lasting imprint that would shape both her life and the legacy of the house itself. Yet the peaceful days at Royal Lodge would not last unchanged. As the shadows of a global conflict crept across Europe, the quiet refuge where Elizabeth and Margaret had grown would soon take on a new purpose, one that tested its strength and deepened its place in royal history. As Europe drifted toward chaos in the late 1930s, the quiet life at Royal Lodge began to shift in ways no one inside its peaceful walls could have imagined. What had been a warm family home, filled with laughter, picnics, lessons, and the innocent routines of childhood, suddenly found itself at the edge of a world changing with alarming speed. The calm of Windsor Great Park stood in stark contrast to the political storms gathering across the continent, but even in this secluded estate, the tension in the air became unmistakable. Royal Lodge, once a symbol of simplicity and domestic comfort, was about to assume a far more serious role, a shelter, a fortress of sorts, and a haven where the royal family sought to maintain unity while the world outside edged closer to upheaval. When war finally erupted in 1939, everything changed. London, crowded, industrial, and exposed, became a target almost immediately. The royal family, though determined to remain in the country, needed a place where they could stay safe without disappearing from public life altogether. Windsor emerged as the natural refuge. It sat just far enough from the capital to lessen the risk of direct attacks, yet close enough for the monarchy to remain symbolically present. For the Duke and Duchess of York and their daughters, Royal Lodge became the heart of this refuge. Its familiar rooms, once used for music lessons and afternoon tea, now took on a heavier purpose. They became spaces where responsibility and resilience were cultivated in equal measure. From the outside, the house still looked serene, bathed in morning light and framed by the protective woods of the Great Park. But inside, small transformations signaled the seriousness of the times. Windows were reinforced. Rooms were reorganized to serve dual functions, part living space, part strategic shelter. Staff received training on emergency procedures, preparing for scenarios nobody wished to imagine. The once carefree lawn became a site for air raid drills. The gardens, where Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret had spent countless days playing among the roses, now hid trenches and reinforced areas designed to offer immediate protection should the worst occur. Despite these preparations, the house remained a place where the family tried to preserve some sense of normalcy for their daughters. Princess Elizabeth studied in rooms that overlooked the park, her lessons continuing under the watchful eyes of tutors, determined not to let the war interrupt her education. Margaret's lively energy brought warmth into the house, even on the darkest days, and the sisters found comfort in each other's company. They played games, practiced piano, and explored the safer areas of the estate, inventing adventures that allowed them, at least for a few hours, to escape the reality unfolding beyond the park's boundaries. Royal Lodge also became a quiet command post of sorts for the Duke and Duchess. The Duke of York, soon to become King George VI, faced mounting responsibilities as Britain entered one of the most challenging periods in its history. He frequently traveled to London to support the government and military efforts, returning to Royal Lodge in the evenings to be with his family. The Duchess, known for her calm strength, served as the emotional anchor of the household, offering reassurance to both her children and the staff. She encouraged everyone to maintain routines, finding solace in familiar rhythms, even as the world beyond the gates grew increasingly unpredictable. One of the most striking images from this period is that of the two young princesses practicing for their first wartime radio broadcast. In a small room of Royal Lodge, far from the noise of the world, but deeply connected to its sorrows, Elizabeth and Margaret rehearsed words meant to comfort children who had been evacuated from their homes. Their voices, steady for their age, carried across Britain and offered a message of unity, resilience, and hope. It was a moment that revealed how even a place built for privacy could become a stage for national reassurance. Nights at Royal Lodge carried their own tension. While the bombs rained down over London, the sounds of distant explosions occasionally echoed faintly through the park. The glow of fires burning in the city sometimes reflected off the clouds, visible from the estate as eerie flashes in the sky. The family would gather together, often in reinforced rooms, listening for updates on the radio as aircraft roared overhead. In those moments, the grandeur of the house mattered far less than the sense of togetherness within its walls. Royal Lodge turned into a symbol of endurance, a place where the royal family faced danger like every other household in the country, sharing the same fears, the same sleepless nights, and the same hope for the dawn. In the daytime, the estate became a sanctuary of purpose. The Duke of York walked the grounds with military advisors, discussing strategy and morale. The Duchess spent time writing letters and organizing charitable efforts, maintaining her commitment to supporting communities affected by the conflict. Staff members worked tirelessly to keep the estate functioning, while remaining vigilant against air raids and shortages. Through it all, the sisters continued to grow, learning not only reading and arithmetic, but responsibility, empathy, and strength, qualities that would shape Elizabeth's future role as a monarch during some of Britain's most defining decades. Royal Lodge, in these years, became more than a home. It became a testament to unity in the face of turmoil, a place where duty and family intertwined. Its halls carried the weight of unspoken worries, yet also the warmth of shared resilience. The estate sheltered the future queen, not just from physical danger, but from losing the sense of stability that childhood requires. And as war reshaped the world, the house stood steadfast, holding the family together through the longest nights and most uncertain months. By the time the conflict began to ease, Royal Lodge had transformed once again, not by architectural design or royal decree, but by the lives lived within it. It had proven itself not just a picturesque estate, but a sanctuary capable of absorbing fear, offering comfort, and shaping a future monarch forged by the shadows and the spirit of those turbulent years. The years that followed would usher in yet another transformation, one defined not by war but by devotion, memory, and the profound presence of a woman whose love for Royal Lodge would shape it for half a century. When the war years finally loosened their grip and Britain stepped cautiously into a new era, Royal Lodge entered what would become the most radiant chapter in its long history. The estate, which had served as both sanctuary and stronghold through the darkest nights, now blossomed under the presence of the woman who would define its spirit for the next half-century, the Queen Mother. After her husband, King George VI, passed away and her daughter ascended the throne, she chose Royal Lodge as her permanent residence. A decision that transformed the estate from a wartime refuge into one of the most beloved royal homes in modern memory. From the moment she settled in, something about the house seemed to come alive. It was as if the walls, still echoing with the tension of the recent past, exhaled and relaxed under her warmth. She carried with her an innate sense of hospitality, a tradition of graciousness deeply rooted in her personality. Royal Lodge did not simply become her home. It became a living portrait of her character, filled with laughter, sunlight, good food, generous company, and a sense of welcome so genuine that visitors felt more like family than guests. Inside, she began shaping the interiors with a blend of refinement and comfort. The grand drawing room, once shadowed by war, regained its glow. Soft pastel tones appeared on the walls, accented by floral patterns and elegant furniture that balanced charm with sophistication. Lamps were placed thoughtfully to cast warm pools of light across polished tables. Portraits and framed photographs blended history with intimacy, each carrying stories she gladly shared during afternoon teas. Even the fireplaces, restored and carefully maintained, burned with a gentle flame that added to the home's atmosphere of peace. Visitors often remarked that stepping into Royal Lodge during those years felt like entering a world suspended between elegance and serenity, where you could admire the beauty around you without ever feeling out of place. But the true heart of the estate lay outdoors, where the Queen Mother's passion flourished most vividly. She cultivated the gardens with a devotion that verged on artistry, her love for flowers was famous, and she worked closely with gardeners to design landscapes that shifted with the seasons in soft, harmonious waves of color. Roses in delicate shades of pink and cream intertwined with sturdy shrubs. Lilacs, hydrangeas, and wild varieties of English blooms filled the air with fragrance. Pathways meandered gently between carefully pruned hedges and bursts of color that seemed almost choreographed. Early morning walks became a cherished ritual. Staff often saw her wandering among the flower beds at dawn, wearing a coat loosely draped over her shoulders, pausing to admire a new bloom or discuss which plants had thrived through the night. Under her guidance, Royal Lodge's gardens became legendary, capturing the admiration of visitors from around the world. They were not stiff or overly manicured. They were charming, romantic, and alive, much like the Queen Mother herself. The estate soon became a hub of cheerful gatherings. The Queen Mother had a gift for creating an atmosphere where people felt relaxed, entertained, and valued. She hosted picnics on the lawns, garden parties that sparkled under the summer sun, and intimate dinners where laughter flowed as easily as conversation. Politicians, artists, writers, friends, family members, everyone who crossed the threshold of Royal Lodge left with memories of warmth and delight. Some described the house as magical. Others said it felt like visiting a cherished relative rather than a member of the royal family. Her grandchildren were among the most frequent guests. The future King Charles, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward spent countless holidays and weekends at Royal Lodge. For them, the estate was a playground of imagination and joy. They ran between the trees, invented games on the lawns, and discovered hidden corners of the gardens that seemed designed just for exploration. The Queen Mother encouraged their adventures, often watching from a terrace or joining them for quiet conversations beneath shaded trees. It was here that many of their sweetest childhood memories were formed. Such was the influence of her presence that the house itself seemed to respond. Rooms felt brighter, corridors filled with a gentle rhythm of footsteps and laughter, and the air carried the unmistakable sense of being in a place deeply loved. Royal Lodge during these decades became a symbol of everything the Queen Mother embodied: grace, kindness, resilience, and the ability to find joy even in simple moments. Evenings brought their own charm. Guests often found themselves gathered in cozy rooms with soft music playing in the background, sharing stories late into the night. The Queen Mother had a particular talent for storytelling, recalling moments from her youth or lighter anecdotes from royal life. No matter how grand the occasion or how distinguished the guest list, the atmosphere remained intimate. This was her gift, turning a royal residence into a home that radiated warmth. Over the years, Royal Lodge transformed into something almost mythical in the public imagination. It stood not as a symbol of wealth or power, but as an emblem of continuity, affection, and personal history. It was the royal home where formality loosened, where laughter echoed across the lawns, and where the weight of the crown felt just a little lighter. The Queen Mother's time there cemented the estate's reputation as a place of joy. Under her care, Royal Lodge reached a golden age, its gardens blooming brighter, its halls ringing with life, its legacy deepening with each passing year. Even after she grew older, her devotion to the home never waned. She remained its heart, its warmth, and its guiding spirit. But as her long and remarkable life drew to a close, the estate once again stood at the threshold of change. Its golden era, filled with light and affection, would leave behind a powerful imprint. And once she was gone, the house would face a new set of challenges, ones far more complicated than anything it had endured before. When the Queen Mother's long chapter at Royal Lodge came to an end, the estate entered a silence so deep it felt almost physical. For decades the house had pulsed with warmth, soft music spilling from open windows, footsteps crossing polished floors, laughter drifting across the gardens. But the moment her presence faded, the property seemed to lose its center of gravity. Rooms that once felt alive settled into stillness. Corridors that held the echo of children's voices and late-night storytelling now carried only the faint hum of an empty building, adjusting to its own quiet. The departure of its most devoted resident left the estate suspended between eras. Royal Lodge had been more than just her home. It had been an extension of her personality, a sanctuary infused with care, charm, and gentle affection. Without her, the delicate balance she maintained began to tilt. Curtains were drawn more often than opened. Fires that once crackled in nearly every room now remained unlit. The staff, who had worked tirelessly to uphold the home's rhythms, suddenly found themselves responsible for maintaining a place whose purpose no longer felt clear. The gardens were the first to reveal the change. Under the Queen Mother's tender attention, they had been a masterpiece of color and fragrance. Now the pathways grew softer around the edges, as if nature sensed the absence of the hand that once guided it. Roses continued to bloom, but without the same carefully orchestrated harmony. Tall grass began to creep along the borders, and the fountains, once regularly inspected, seemed quieter, their water losing the bright clarity they once held. The estate had not yet fallen into disrepair, but it had unmistakably lost the vibrancy that made it legendary. Inside the house, subtle signs of aging began to surface. Walls that had absorbed decades of warmth seemed colder. Fabrics that once carried floral brightness began to fade under muted light. Sections of plaster loosened, barely noticeable at first, but growing slowly as months passed. The structure, long accustomed to constant movement and sound, felt heavy under the weight of absence. Even the air carried a different tone, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply tired. Royal Lodge was always a house defined by whoever lived within it, shaped by their habits, their values, and their energy. With no guiding spirit, the estate drifted, waiting for its next chapter, yet unable to escape the shadow of the one that had just ended. Staff continued to care for the property, but even the most dedicated among them could not replace the atmosphere that the Queen Mother had created. The house had lost its heart, and no amount of diligence could restore the feeling of presence that once radiated through every room. As the months passed, the estate became a symbol of transition. It stood firmly in its place, stately, dignified, proud, but without the warmth that softened its edges. Visitors who returned after her departure remarked on how different it felt, how the house seemed larger, quieter, and somehow farther removed from the world around it. The absence was palpable, settling into corners and lingering on the edges of conversations. Some described it as though the house itself was grieving, adjusting slowly to life without the woman who had given it purpose for half a century. For the royal family, the question of the estate's future became inevitable. Royal Lodge could not remain in limbo forever. As a property of historical and practical importance, it required a new era, a new interpretation, and a new steward. Yet, choosing the next occupant was not simple. Whoever stepped into the Queen Mother's place would inherit more than a residence. They would inherit a legacy defined by affection, generosity, and a deep connection to the land. The transition from a lively sanctuary to a quiet, echoing house marked the beginning of Royal Lodge's slow decline. Not a dramatic collapse, but a gentle unraveling, a fading of light, a soft loosening of the threads that had once held everything together. The estate was waiting, suspended in a moment between past and future, knowing that the next decision would set the course for decades to come. And as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, that decision arrived, pulling Royal Lodge into a new chapter, one defined not by warmth and celebration, but by questions, responsibilities, and consequences that would shape its destiny in unexpected ways. When the time finally came to choose a new guardian for Royal Lodge, the decision carried the weight of history. The estate, still echoing with the Queen Mother's presence, needed someone willing to inhabit not just the building, but the legacy embedded in every stone. In 2003, that responsibility fell to Prince Andrew, the Queen Mother's grandson and the second son of Queen Elizabeth II. What followed was not a simple handover or symbolic gesture. It was the beginning of a financial and emotional entanglement that would bind the prince to the property in ways no one yet understood. The solution chosen by the Crown Estate was unusual. Instead of simply assigning the residence as a royal housing privilege, they offered a 75-year lease. This meant that Andrew would not merely occupy Royal Lodge, he would, in many ways, assume responsibility for its survival. The terms were clear. He would pay a modest initial sum, $1 million up front, and, far more importantly, commit to restoring and maintaining the estate. The agreement required him to invest approximately $7.5 million in renovations, a figure that reflected both the property's grandeur and its growing list of structural problems. As long as he upheld these obligations, the mansion would effectively remain his home until 2078. From the outside, it looked like a mutually beneficial arrangement. Royal Lodge would be cared for, preserved, and inhabited once again. Prince Andrew would secure a beautiful residence closely tied to his grandmother's memory. The Crown Estate would avoid a massive financial burden while ensuring the building did not fall further into decline. Newspapers at the time framed the arrangement almost as a continuation of tradition, one generation picking up where another left off. But beneath the surface, the reality was far more complicated. Royal Lodge was not an easy property to inherit. By the time Andrew received the keys, years of gentle decline had accumulated into serious issues. The roof leaked during storms. Foundations in some areas required reinforcement. Interior walls showed signs of damp and age. The gardens, once maintained with meticulous devotion, had lost their coherence. Even the smaller buildings scattered around the grounds needed attention. The estate was vast, beautiful, and deeply prestigious, but it was also a financial giant, demanding constant resources to stay upright. Prince Andrew approached the project with determination. He launched into the required renovations, expanding efforts beyond what the lease explicitly obligated him to do. Rooms were repaired, roofs patched, and the main structure stabilized. Contractors, engineers, landscapers, and restoration experts were brought in to revive the mansion and its grounds. Millions were spent, and for a time, it appeared that Royal Lodge would return to its earlier splendor. The idea of fulfilling his grandmother's legacy seemed to motivate him, giving the project a sense of personal meaning. Yet the more work was done, the more the estate revealed its hidden costs. Every repair seemed to uncover a deeper issue. Materials needed replacing. Systems required modernization. The sheer age and scale of the property turned maintenance into a constant battle. What had begun as a grand restoration became an ongoing struggle, one that demanded far more money than anyone originally expected. Even initial renovations costing millions could not shield the home from long-term upkeep. Royal Lodge was not a static masterpiece. It was a living structure in constant need of attention. The financial strain raised quiet questions almost immediately. Unlike in earlier decades when royal residences were funded through public allowances or official duties, Prince Andrew was, at this point, expected to shoulder the bulk of the expenses himself. And while he had income from various sources, he no longer enjoyed the level of official funding that other senior royals received. Observers began wondering how the enormous annual costs, estimated at $3 to $4 million per year, were being met. These murmurs of curiosity soon grew into whispers, and whispers into speculation. Prince Andrew had never been a stranger to public scrutiny, but his connection to Royal Lodge added a new dimension. Every rumor about financial difficulties, every revelation about costly repairs, every mention of delays or structural failures became fodder for public debate. The estate's grandeur, once a symbol of royal continuity, began to look like an anchor, pulling him deeper into a complex, expensive commitment. Royal Lodge, which had once carried an atmosphere of comfort and celebration, was now increasingly associated with secrecy and financial strain. Questions arose about private deals, income sources, and the prince's ability to sustain the property long-term. Although many of these suspicions lacked definitive answers, the uncertainty cast a shadow over the mansion. What should have been a peaceful inheritance became instead the foundation of a narrative marked by pressure, responsibility, and the looming sense that something about the arrangement was not built to last. The mansion had a new occupant, but it did not regain its former harmony. Instead, it entered a chapter defined by obligations heavier than sentiment. Royal Lodge, once nurtured by the Queen Mother's gentle hands, now existed in a world dominated by financial realities and public expectation. The quiet refuge she had crafted began to feel more like a stage set for future dispute. Its walls holding not just memories but unresolved questions about money, legacy, and ownership. And as the years unfolded, these tensions would grow, turning the estate from a home into a battleground where private loyalty, public scrutiny, and the weight of royal heritage collided in increasingly dramatic ways. Royal Lodge had always demanded attention, but in the years following Prince Andrew's takeover, the estate revealed a hunger far greater than even its most devoted defenders expected. What began as an inheritance wrapped in nostalgia slowly transformed into a financial organism, one that consumed resources at an astonishing rate. The scale of the property's deterioration was not just surprising, it was overwhelming. Behind the dignified Georgian facade, the mansion was fighting a losing battle against time, weather, and decades of quiet neglect. The roof was the first and most urgent warning. During storms, water slipped through weakened tiles and seeped into the upper floors, staining ceilings and leaving behind a faint, sour smell that crept unnoticed into hallways. Buckets appeared in corners during heavy rain, their steady dripping a reminder that the house no longer functioned as the solid structure it once was. Roofing specialists who examined the estate reported that large sections needed complete replacement. The repairs were not simple patches but costly, complex reconstructions requiring scaffolding, specialized materials, and weeks, sometimes months, of labor. Once water found its way in, it created problems that spread like illness through the interior. Dampness accumulated in the walls and floors, paving the way for mold that took root behind wallpaper and beneath wooden panels. In certain rooms, especially those that had remained unused for long periods, the smell of moisture became unmistakable. Engineers discovered dark streaks creeping upward along the plaster, indicating not only mold but structural compromise. Treating these issues required more than cosmetic attention. Entire sections needed to be stripped down, dried, reinforced, and rebuilt. Each intervention added another layer to the estate's mounting expenses. Then came the cracks. At first, they seemed harmless, thin lines no longer than a handspan, barely perceptible unless one stood close. But over the years, they widened. Some traveled across ceilings like brittle veins. Others split down walls behind bookcases, revealing the house's silent struggle to hold itself together. A few were so deep that engineers worried the stability of certain rooms was at risk. These fractures were not superficial blemishes. They were symptoms of shifting foundations, aging materials, and the pressure exerted by a heavy, sprawling structure built long before modern standards. Repairing them required specialists who understood the delicate balance between preserving historical character and ensuring safety. The decay outside was just as revealing. The once immaculate gardens, famous under the Queen Mother's care, began to lose their vitality. The formal beds where roses once bloomed in perfect rows were overrun by weeds that grew in tangled clusters. Moss crept up stone statues, blurring their features beneath a damp green film. Ornamental fountains ran slower each year until their water turned cloudy, reflecting the estate's broader decline. The lawns, once kept in an almost painterly state of perfection, developed uneven patches where irrigation systems failed. Even the ancient trees surrounding the property showed signs of distress, their branches overgrown because regular pruning had become inconsistent. Smaller structures scattered across the grounds were no better. The gardener's cottage had damp seeping into its floors. Storage buildings showed signs of wood rot. Fences buckled under harsh winters. Pathways cracked and sprouted weeds. The estate no longer resembled the picturesque sanctuary it once was. It had become a sprawling landscape of urgent repairs, each one demanding immediate, expensive intervention. Behind these visual symptoms lay a larger problem. The cost of maintaining Royal Lodge was skyrocketing beyond reasonable expectation. Experts estimated yearly expenses between $4 million and $5 million, a figure that exceeded the upkeep of many operational palaces. Every year required new investment simply to prevent the estate from sliding further into decay. And because the property was not merely old but historically significant, repairs needed to meet conservation standards, which were far more expensive than ordinary work. At first, much of the deterioration remained hidden from the public. The estate's high walls and secluded position shielded its problems from casual observers. But news has a way of slipping through cracks, just as water does through a weakened roof. Reports began circulating about the severity of the decline, and soon Royal Lodge found itself thrust into national conversation. Headlines questioned how such a valuable piece of royal heritage could be allowed to crumble. Commentators debated who should be responsible for its upkeep. Critics pointed to the staggering costs and asked why a private individual, especially one no longer performing royal duties, continued living in a home that demanded so much. Drone photographs captured glimpses of sagging rooflines. Aerial shots revealed discoloration in the stonework. Leak reports, mold sightings, and engineering assessments made their way into newspapers and documentaries. Royal Lodge, once admired for its tranquility, was now portrayed as a symbol of extravagance running unchecked, a mansion that swallowed millions while hospitals and schools across the country faced financial strain. The contrast became a talking point across Britain. This was not just an architectural crisis, but a cultural one. To many citizens, Royal Lodge's decay was a metaphor, a reminder of the fragility of institutions, the cost of tradition, and the complicated relationship between heritage and responsibility. To the royals themselves, it was a looming dilemma. The estate could not be abandoned, yet it demanded more than any modern private budget could reasonably sustain. Inside the gates, the house groaned quietly under its own demands. Every year added new challenges, new leaks, new fractures, new signs of aging that could not be ignored. And with each problem that surfaced, the question grew louder. How long could Prince Andrew continue to hold on to a home that required so much? How long could Royal Lodge keep standing without the kind of support only a functioning royal institution could provide? The house was no longer just a residence. It had become a burden too large to hide, too expensive to sustain, and too symbolically significant to ignore. And as the estate strained under its growing weight, pressure from the outside world intensified, setting the stage for a confrontation that would soon break into public view. By the time Charles ascended the throne, Royal Lodge was no longer simply a private residence. It had become the most problematic and politically sensitive property in the entire royal portfolio. Its leaking roofs and spreading mold were only the surface of a much larger issue. Beneath the structural decay lay a tangled web of legal commitments, financial strain, damaged public trust, and the complicated personal history of the man living inside its walls. And as Britain welcomed a new monarch determined to modernize the institution, this sprawling, expensive mansion became the unexpected battleground where two brothers' visions for the future collided. King Charles III stepped into his role with a clear agenda: create what he called a slimmed-down monarchy. For him, the model of a smaller, more efficient royal family was not just a preference but a necessity in a world increasingly skeptical of public spending and hereditary privilege. He wanted transparency, efficiency, and a royal house that reflected the values of a modern nation. In practical terms, this meant fewer working royals, fewer official residences, and fewer instances where private individuals benefited from state-managed properties. Royal Lodge, with its staggering upkeep costs and non-working royal occupant, stood in direct contradiction to this vision. For Prince Andrew, the estate represented something very different. It was not merely a house he leased. It was the last place that connected him to his grandmother, the Queen Mother, and to the happier years when he had been a celebrated member of the family. Royal Lodge was his refuge from the storms that had engulfed his public life. Behind those heavy gates, he felt insulated from scrutiny. Within those 7 bedrooms and wide lawns, he saw a life he was desperately trying to hold on to. To him, leaving the estate was not just a logistical matter. It felt like losing his final anchor. The standoff began quietly. At first, it was little more than polite conversations, suggestions whispered at official meetings, and hints passed along through advisors. Charles encouraged the idea of relocating Andrew to a smaller residence. Frogmore Cottage, recently vacated by Prince Harry and Meghan, appeared to be the most logical choice. It was significantly cheaper to maintain, appropriately sized for a person without official duties, and symbolically aligned with the new image the king wanted to project. Andrew refused. He cited his legally binding 75-year lease, the millions he had already invested into the property, and, though he rarely said it aloud, the emotional bond he held with the place. To him, Royal Lodge was not negotiable. He had paid for the right to stay, and he intended to exercise that right fully. Charles pushed harder. Discussions became firmer. Advisors framed the situation in stark financial terms, highlighting the ballooning cost of maintaining an estate that was visibly deteriorating. They stressed the public anger surrounding the idea that a non-working royal continued to occupy such a valuable property, while the monarchy preached cost-saving reforms. Internal reports warned that the optics were becoming dangerous. that every photograph of decaying walls at Royal Lodge undermined the king's credibility. Still, Andrew would not move. What happened next was a shift from soft pressure to strategic maneuvering. If the king could not evict his brother directly, he could tighten the surrounding conditions. Budget cuts arrived first. Funding that traditionally supported security and maintenance for royal properties was reduced. The expectation was obvious. Without adequate support, Andrew would struggle to maintain the estate to the standards required by his lease, eventually triggering clauses that could allow the Crown estate to reclaim the property. But Andrew anticipated the tactic. He insisted he was fulfilling his obligations, hired contractors to handle the most urgent issues, and pushed back against claims of neglect. The very same leaks, cracks, and mold that journalists described as catastrophic became the focus of a heated internal dispute. One side claimed the house was in unacceptable decline. The other insisted it was being managed appropriately within realistic means. Engineers were consulted, reports drafted, and each document seemed to fuel rather than resolve the conflict. The media dubbed it the Siege of Royal Lodge. It wasn't an overstatement. The estate became a fortress, not militarily, but symbolically. A house surrounded by the pressure of public opinion, political reform, and private emotion. Visitors recall an atmosphere thick with tension. Even the quiet roads leading into Windsor Great Park seemed to carry the weight of unspoken arguments. Staff members, long accustomed to discretion, described an environment where every repair, every invoice, every rumor about future plans felt charged with larger implications. The king's frustration grew as the months passed. From the windows of Windsor Castle, just 3 miles away, Charles could see the estate that had become the most stubborn obstacle in his modernization agenda. Royal Lodge stood there like an immovable stone, not merely dilapidating in structure, but stubborn in symbolism. It represented a monarchy struggling to shed its old skin, held back by one man's refusal to let go of his last sanctuary. What made the situation even more complex was the cold reality of the lease. Charles, despite being king, could not simply remove his brother. The contract protected Andrew with surprising strength. Unless he violated its conditions, he had every right to remain until 2078. For a monarch determined to reshape the institution, this was a legal wall too thick to break through without triggering public backlash or appearing vindictive. And so, the conflict tightened, neither brother willing or able to yield. The house became the silent third participant in their private war. Its sagging structure, its peeling paint, its aging foundations, all of it stood as a metaphor for a monarchy caught between past and present. Royal Lodge was no longer just an estate. It had become a stage for a clash of values, a symbol of the old world, holding its ground against the new. Inside, Andrew continued his daily routines, walking the dogs, reading newspapers by the window, greeting staff with familiar calm. Outside, headlines grew sharper, public opinion shifted, and pressure mounted. Every new story about royal spending inevitably circled back to Royal Lodge. Every debate about reform or accountability pointed in its direction. The mansion had become the flashpoint in a national conversation about privilege, responsibility, and the future of the Windsors. And as tensions escalated, the estate itself seemed to absorb the strain, settling deeper into the kind of uneasy stillness that precedes a turning point. The conflict had begun as a matter of logistics and finances, but it was quickly becoming something much larger, a battle not just over property, but over identity, legacy, and the direction of the monarchy itself. By the time the conflict around Royal Lodge reached its peak, the house had begun to occupy a space in the national imagination far beyond its physical boundaries. It no longer existed merely as a residence tucked quietly inside Windsor Great Park. Instead, it became a symbol that reflected the uncertain shape of the monarchy itself, caught between the weight of tradition and the pressure to evolve. To many observers, Royal Lodge looked less like a home and more like a question posed directly to the crown. What should be preserved and what must finally change? The house's duality made it impossible to ignore. On one hand, it still carried the charm of its golden past. From a distance, the cream-colored walls and stately Georgian proportions shone with the same quiet dignity that had defined it for generations. The long driveway, shaded by ancient trees, evoked images of royal carriages, childhood laughter, and the Queen Mother's afternoon teas. The gardens, though softer around the edges, retained the outlines of a place once crafted with great affection. There were moments, certain angles, certain hours of sunlight, when the estate looked frozen in time, as if refusing to acknowledge the decades that had passed. Yet up close, that illusion dissolved. The cracks running along the walls resembled scars accumulated over years of strain. The musty smell deep inside the house whispered of damp corridors and old wiring struggling to keep up. Parts of the roof sagged under repeated repairs, and the windows rattled in their frames whenever strong winds swept across the park. This physical decline felt symbolic. The mansion appeared torn between its glorious heritage and its deteriorating present, just as the monarchy wrestled with balancing centuries-old customs against modern expectations. Royal Lodge embodied the very tension that defined the conversation around Britain's royal future.